And tonight's story is a story of the pond. See the water in the pond and the tree? And who are these? Look at those long white necks and the black heads. Hmm. The pond Sam had discovered on that spring morning was seldom visited by any human being. All winter snow had covered the ice. The pond lay cold and still under its white blanket. Most of the time there wasn't a sound to be heard. The frog was asleep. The chipmunk was asleep. Occasionally a blue jay would cry out, and sometimes at night a fox would bark, a high, rasping bark. Winter seemed to last forever. But one day a change came over the woods and the pond. Warm air, soft and kind, blew through the trees. The ice which had softened during the night became melted. Patches of open water appeared. All the creatures that lived in the pond and the woods were glad to feel the warmth. They heard and felt the breath of spring, and they stirred with new life and hope. There was a good new smell in the air, and the smell of earth waking after its long sleep. The frog, who was buried in the mud at the bottom of the pond, knew that spring was here. The chickadee knew and was delighted. Almost everyone delights a chickadee. The fox, sleeping in her den, she knew she would soon have kits. Every creature knew that a better, easier time was at hand. Warmer, pleasant days and nights. Trees were putting out green buds, and the buds were swelling. The birds were arriving from the south. A pair of ducks flew in. The red-winged blackbird arrived and scouted the pond for a nesting site. A small sparrow with a white throat arrived and sang, "Oh, sweet Canada, Canada." I don't do the singing part of this. And if you had been sitting by the pond on that first warm day of spring, suddenly, toward the end of the afternoon, you would have heard a stirring sound high in the air, the sound like trumpets. Caw, caw. And if you had looked up, you would have seen, high overhead, two great white birds. They flew swiftly, their legs stretched out straight behind, their long white necks stretched out straight ahead, their powerful wings beating and strong. Caw, caw, caw. The noise is extra. The thrilling noise in the sky, the trumpeting of the swans. When the birds spotted the pond, they began circling, looking for a place to land from the air. Then they glided down and came to rest in the water, folding their long wings neatly along their sides and turning their heads this way and that way to study the new surroundings. They were trumpeter swans, pure white birds with black bills and black beaks. They had liked the looks of the swampy pond and decided this was going to be it. They're going to raise their family right here. The two swans were tired from a long flight, and they're glad to be down out of the sky. They paddled slowly about and began feeding, thrusting their necks into the shallow water and pulling up roots and plants from the bottom. Everything about the swans was white, except their bills and their feet, which were both black. They carried their heads high. The pond seemed a different place because of their arrival. For the next few days, the swans rested. When they're hungry, they ate. When they're thirsty, they drank. On the 10th day, the female began looking around to find a place to build her nest. In the spring of the year, nest building is upmost in a bird's mind. It is the most important thing there is. If she picks a good place, she stands a good chance of hatching her eggs and rearing her young family. Like on the other side of that shed next door. If she picks a bad place, she may fail to raise a family. The female swan knew this. The mommy knew. She knew that the decision was very important. The two swans first investigated the other end of the pond where a stream flowed slowly in. It was nice, with reeds and bulrushes. Red-winged blackbirds were busy nesting in this part of the pond, and a pair of mallard ducks were there too. Then the swans swam to the lower end of the pond, a marsh with woods on one side and a dear flat meadow on the other. It was lonely here. From one shore, a point of land extended out into the pond. It was a sandy strip of land, a little like an island, and at the tip there were a few feet out into the water. It was a tiny island, a little bit bigger than a table. One small tree grew there, and there were rocks and ferns and grasses. "Look at this!" exclaimed the female swan, as she swam around and around. "Caw!" replied her husband, who liked to have someone ask his advice. The swan stepped cautiously out into the island. The spot seemed to be made to order. It was just right for a nesting place. When the daddy swan floated close by, watching, she snooped around until she found a very nice spot on the ground. And can you see her there? Can you see the swans there? She sat down to see how it felt to be sitting there, and she decided it was just the right size for her. Nicely located, a couple feet from the water's edge, very convenient, Starbucks nearby. She turned to her husband. "What do you think?" she said. "An ideal location," he said. "A perfect place." "And I will tell you why it's a perfect place," he said majestically. "If an enemy or a fox or a raccoon or a skunk or a cat wanted to reach this spot and have murder in his heart and have to eat those eggs, he'd have to swim in the water, and then he'd have to get wet. And before he could get in the water, he'd have to walk the whole length of any piece of land, and that time we'd see him and hear him and give him a hard time." The male stretched out his great wings, 8 feet from tip to tip, and gave the water a mighty bang to show his strength. This made him feel better right away. When a trumpeter swan hits his enemy with his wing, it's like being hit by a baseball bat. The male swan, by the way, is called a cob. Nobody knows why, but that's why. A good many animals have special names. A male goose is called a gander. A male cow is called a bull. A male sheep is called a ram. A male chicken is called a rooster, and so on and so on. Anyway, the thing to remember is that a male swan is called a cob. Well, the cob, the male swan's wife, pretended not to notice that her husband was showing off, but she saw it all right, and she was proud of him and his big, strong wings and his courage. As husbands go, he was a good one. And there was the non-disclosure prenuptial agreement that they signed. The cob watched his beautiful wife sitting there on the tiny island. To his great joy, he saw her begin to turn slowly round and around, keeping always in the same spot, flopping through the mud and the grass. She was making the first motions of nesting. First, she squatted down in the place she chose. Then she twisted around and around, banging down the earth with her webbed feet, hollowing it out to make it like a dish, like a saucer, like a cereal bowl. It was dished out. Then she reached down and pulled out twigs and grasses toward her, and she dropped them at her sides under her tail, and she started shaping them, and she sat down, and then the cob, that's the male one, remember, floated close to his mate. He studied every move she made. "Now another medium-sized stick, my love," he said, and she poked her splendid, long, white, graceful neck as far as it would go, picked up a stick, and placed it at her side. "Now another piece of coarse grass," said the daddy, with great dignity. The female reached for grasses, for moss, for twigs, for anything that was handy. Slowly and carefully she built up the nest until she was sitting on a big grassy dish. She worked at the task for a couple of hours, and then knocked off for the day and slid into the pond to take a drink and have lunch. "A fine start," said the cob, as he gazed back at the nest. "A perfect beginning. I don't know how you managed it so cleverly." "It comes naturally," replied his wife. "There's a lot of work to it, but the whole is very pleasant." "Yes," said the Cobb, the daddy, "and when you're done you'll have something to show for your trouble. You'll have a swan's nest 6 feet across. What other bird can say that?" "Well," said his wife, "maybe an eagle can say it." "Yeah, but in that case it wouldn't be a swan's nest. It'd be an eagle's nest, and it would be high up in some old dead tree somewhere, instead of right down near the water with all the conveniences that go with the water." And they both laughed. And then they began trumpeting and splashing and scooping up water and throwing it on their backs, darting around as though they had suddenly gone crazy. "Caw, caw, caw," they cried. Every wild creature within a mile and a half of the pond heard the trumpeting of the swans. The fox heard, the raccoon heard, the skunk heard. One pair of ears heard, but they didn't belong to a wild creature. But the swans didn't know that. That's the end of chapter 2.